We are back on Curious Apes with Rob Chavez, who is an associate professor at the University of Oregon, where he runs the Computational Social Neuroscience Lab. All those words I think I got correct. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Rob, to start, I want to just kind of jump into kind of what you do, if you can just kind of lay a little bit of the foundation for your field of study and what kind of questions you like to explore.
Yeah, so I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training, which means a lot of different things, but what it usually means is that I use brain imaging to study cognitive processes. But if I had to put a label on it, a social neuroscientist. So that just means I use this cognitive neuroscience training to understand how the brain processes social information, broadly construed. So, the way that some people talk about this is kind of like it's a marriage between social psychology and, cognitive neuroscience. And I think that's a nice way to put it. But it depends on exactly what you're talking about. Sometimes my questions are very social behavior first, and what are the brain mechanisms that support those kind of things. But more often, I would say I'm interested in the brain first and how social processes are represented in that, because the brain turns out still a pretty big mystery and does all those things. So that's what I see a lot of our work kind of tackling, and it just depends on what the goal of the particular study is trying to get at.
Yeah, how would somebody maybe differentiate between what a social neuroscientist does versus a typical neuroscientist? Are there things that maybe do differentiate the two in a pretty significant way?
Yeah, so when you're talking about neuroscience, it's a gigantic field, right? That's like saying I'm an engineer. It's like, an engineer of what? Or I'm a doctor, I'm a physician. It's like, well, what's your specialty? So neuroscience is a big field. There's some people who do molecular neuroscience, where they're looking at sodium ion channels, or they're looking at other kind of neurobiological processes that are about the cells themselves, right? Then there's people who kind of zoom out from that a little bit, and maybe they're behavioral neuroscientists, they're sometimes called. So they're still studying behavior. It's usually in animals, but it's maybe in neural populations or in individual neurons while a rat is running around a maze or something like that. And then once you zoom out to social neuro, it can kind of encompass a few different things. So there's some researchers who do the behavioral neuro stuff in animals, but more typically what you'll see when somebody calls themselves a social neuroscientist is people doing neuroimaging work. So it's people often doing fMRI work, or maybe doing EEG type work, or there's other kinds of neuroimaging modalities too that people use, but it's almost always within the realm of social and affective processes broadly construed.
Okay. And then you come in and you add one more layer. So we're going to add another layer to the pie here, and you add the computational aspect as well. What does that add to the mix?
I mean, to be honest, it's a bit of a marketing ploy. Like, not really. So like the typical way we do neuroimaging studies is, they're kind of complicated. There's lots of computation that goes on underneath them all the time, right? We're fitting these models to brain activation things. We're doing it in hundreds of thousands of voxels. But the way that our experimental designs kind of typically went was, okay, so we see this brain region activate more to this condition than to that condition. Great. We can say that this part of the brain is more involved in that process than in this other one. That's fine, but what we've learned in kind of the last, 20 years or so of cognitive neuroscience is that there's different ways that you can use those voxel activation patterns, or those brain region activation patterns, to kind of not just say, where is this region more active than that one, but what is the pattern of activity in that region? Is it different than the pattern of activity in that same region for a different type of task, right? So even if there isn't a mean difference, but the individual things within it are activating in a different pattern, you might be able to differentiate them. And it turns out when you have lots of different little pieces, that need to, little activation nodes or voxels in fMRI or electrodes in EEG or whatever. If you need to differentiate patterns, things like machine learning turn out to be really useful. So it's not just machine learning. There's lots of different ways of doing computational modeling, but that's been the one that we use a lot in my lab. And so, computational social neuroscience is just saying that we emphasize these kind of multivariate approaches to understanding social cognition mostly. And that's a little bit of different flavor than the one that I was trained on, or at least what was happening in the field, not too long ago. And it's really ramped up in terms of how many people are using these methods, how common they are. I kind of feel that, these are going to become commonplace in the near future.
Yeah. Can you quickly? Yeah, it's going to increase. I would definitely want to jump to that in a second. Can you quickly explain what a voxel is for people who might not be familiar with the term?
I probably should have said that. So, when we're doing MRI work, there's these units. So you put somebody in the brain scanner. It gives back information about whatever it is that you're measuring, but the units that they're doing it in are in these volumetric pixels, right? So they're images, but they're in volumes, so volumetric pixels, voxels. But it's basically the smallest unit of measurement that you'll find in any kind of MRI-based study. So that could be fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. It can be structural magnetic resonance imaging. It can also be things like diffusion imaging, which get at other things as well. But anything from the MRI machine, typically in cognitive neuroscience, you'll see in voxels. So when we're talking about multiple voxels, we're just saying multiple units of measurement.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So with that being said, I feel like one question a lot of people have when I talk to them about neuroscience is how reliable is this type of imaging data? How much is it just kind of correlational? How much of it's just kind of building a map and doing anatomy more than really getting at a true understanding of neural correlates for daily behavior and stuff? For your work, what are kind of the ways that you look at that or reflect on that, like criticism or concern that the spatial or temporal resolution as it is of these imaging things leaves something to be desired?
I agree with all of it.
Fair enough.
So and it's important to keep yourself grounded in these things. That doesn't make it not useful. So let me give some examples, or unpack it a little bit. So for MRI research, people say, oh, it's just correlational. And you bet, it's just correlational. And in fact, the whole way that we do it is correlational, right? So we put somebody in the scanner, we show them some happy faces and we show them some sad faces. That's over a course of a time series. And then we correlate the activation patterns after some mathematical trickery to our model. And we get from the end of that a model fit for one condition over another one. And we look to see where is that model fit better for happy faces than for sad faces in which part of the brain. And then we can say, hey, this part of the brain seems to be more active for happy than. It's all correlations. Like it's correlations all the way down, right? So that is a criticism at some level, but that's what we're doing, unless we're doing things that have a little bit more of a causal flavor to them, and that's when you start to get into these other kinds of methods. But
that would be more invasive stuff like optogenetics, where you're directly activating.
Yeah, or it could be things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, where they're actually sending an electrical or a magnetic pulse, I should say, to a certain part of the brain to, turn off or turn on a particular brain region in some process, right? Yeah. So that's true. Then there's the reliability issue. And now this is a much bigger topic, and it depends on what you're talking about. So, when we're trying to correlate, let's say, a brain imaging metric of some kind to, I don't know, a personality trait or some, individual differences measure, you do need, it turns out, a lot more subjects than we thought to find reliable, kind of valid, replicable effects in that. And that's been, we've always sort of known that, but that's really been shown a lot more conclusively in the last few years, where it's like, yeah, we want to study differences among people, but we need a lot of people to be able to do
Yeah.
that.
Can you ballpark the sample size for that?
Yeah, so the a recent-ish paper that came out a couple years ago is that basically to get stable individual differences predictions with certain kinds of methods, you need at least, maybe thousands of people.
Mm,
Some would argue that depending on the method that you're using, it's probably not thousands, but it's probably a couple hundred at least if you are studying something that has a strong effect size. Um, but then you start to get into the weeds about the technical stuff, and there's a conversation to be had there. But it's a lot more than you'd think.
yeah.
Now, all of that said, when you're doing brain imaging, not in an individual differences kind of way, but just a within subject kind of way, you don't really need as many people to find reliable effects. And a simple one is, well, a couple simple ones might be things like, okay, I'm looking at a visual stimulus, let's say a flashing checkerboard versus a black screen, a blank screen, right? I can see a reliable effect in V1, which is the primary visual cortex, in one subject that will replicate across every subject you ever do it in that has a functioning V1, right? And that's because what you're doing is you're not saying where are there differences among people. You're saying within a person, which controls for all their idiosyncratic stuff, where are these things greater than another, right? So, when we're doing that in these simple kind of things like visual tasks or motor tasks, tapping your finger for this versus tapping your versus not tapping your finger or tapping a different finger, right? You can see those really easily, but you can see those pretty well in other kinds of tasks that are much less simple as well. It just depends on what you're talking about. So, it's not that there aren't issues or outstanding questions or issues with reliability and whatnot, but it's way more complicated than people who like to than some of the critics who don't use this stuff like to point out.
Right.
And that doesn't mean it's not valid. It just means that there's more to unpack. But it's fair.
Yeah. Yeah. I was in this conversation that I was having recently about this. My rebuttal was, we're talking about something that is as nebulous and infinite as the human condition and cognition and all the different ways that can unfold. And to expect that to be something that has like a physics like poetry to it or rigidity, where it's just like 1 + 1 = 2. It's a lot to ask when you're looking at the brain and behavior.
It's a fantasy. It's
Yeah.
hard to happen. Yeah.
Bearing that in mind, though, as you were saying with computational side of things and the increase in usage of things like machine learning, and especially with what we're seeing with AI right now, the beautiful thing about those technologies is they are really good at finding signal amongst noise. And I feel like if brain imaging and all of this stuff shows us anything, it's that finding signal amongst noise is a really important thing to do. So can you maybe speak to what you see happening in that trajectory, maybe as this technology becomes more prominent? Do you see us potentially being able to make a lot more leaps and gains in knowledge?
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm of a few different minds on this. We use machine learning and, AI, I guess, everybody calls everything AI these days, but we use this stuff in my research and we have for a long time. So part of the reason we do that is because it is good at finding patterns in things. And there's just no question about that. What we've learned empirically from using these methods is that they are a little bit more, they work a little bit better often. Like you get better predictive validity. Working better just means we'd get stronger, predictions from using these methods than we do from kind of traditional methods. But at the same time, I'm I gotta admit to being a little bearish on the promise of AI for really making these leaps that you're talking about. And the reason why is not because of the AI itself, or or the fact that I'm some old Luddite. I'm on my way, but it's really kind of the thing that keeps the bottleneck in all of these things, in my opinion, is our ability to ask interesting questions. So the AI systems, the machine learning models, will find patterns, but a pattern of what, right? And so I think a lot of people think with a new technology will come along, and all of a sudden they'll solve all of our problems and we'll make these big advances. And sometimes that's true, but what really makes the big advancements in a lot of things is the cleverness of the questions and the paradigms that are behind them. When you can augment that stuff with these kind of big computational tools, great. But if you're just kind of throwing the same old questions at them, you shouldn't expect different things to come at it. And that's actually really hard to do, right? To come up with a clever experimental paradigm that you could then test with a computational model. The computational model will do its mathy computational thing, but coming up with that paradigm, that's hard. That's much harder. And I see often people being really good at applying these kind of methods and these fancy tools to older questions, and you get a little bit of purchase there. But the leaps come from these kind of paradigm shifting, like new ways of thinking about the questions, more so than the tools to answer the existing ones. And I think I see that as kind of like the rate limiter, so to speak.
Are you familiar with Eric? I think it's Eric Hoel, Hoel. I believe he was at Tufts, but he wrote a book recently that pretty clearly takes issue with neuroscience. I mean, he is a neuroscientist, and he worked on, I think, on IIT, the integrated information theory with Gioni, what's his name, Tononi. Regardless, his criticism is that neuroscience is kind of suffering a little bit, I think, of what you're saying here. Is it's not coming up with paradigmatic shifts in thinking and asking new questions. It's trying so hard to just build a map, let's say, that it's not actually thinking about what questions should be asked of that map.
Right. And I think that, that's a criticism at some level, but it's also really appropriate at this level.
Yeah.
So I didn't make up this example, but I really like it. So Tycho Brahe, was like the astronomer, amateur astronomer. However, I don't remember the dates, right? But he basically mapped the sky in terms of where the stars were, where the planets were. All he did was make these really detailed observations, basically, of the sky that, Kepler came along and was like, okay, we have all this stuff from Tycho Brahe about the map of the sky. Maybe you can learn something about the movement of the planets, right? And it wasn't, you needed that map of the sky in order to make this theory of the movement of the planets, that then somebody I don't know, Isaac Newton comes along and says, hey, we can learn things about the movement of the planets. Maybe we can have a general theory of motion in general, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to start there. And what I get frustrated with sometimes is people wanting to skip all the hard work, all the boring work of mapping the sky, of making the dumb observations, just so they can get to the Newton level,
The fun stuff.
the fun stuff, right? The things that are really and I think neuroscience appropriately is still in Brahe land. Now, when do you stop, just bean counting? When do you stop looking at the sky and looking for new stars? That's a different question. And how good of a job we're doing there is still tough.
Yeah.
But, when people are critical of it, it's like, well, at some level, of course, we shouldn't be making big claims in Newton territory when we're really still just on the ground here trying to figure out where things are.
Right.
I think that's important to keep in mind as a consumer of neuroscience research. But, for us, it's also as a producer of it as well.
Yeah. And I mean, it does seem like a stepwise function as well, right? Where you're going to have plateaus after every paradigm shift. So like, even if you think you've gotten to that point where you can make a theoretical leap, it's
Yep.
kind of incumbent upon you to make sure that you figure out all the details of what that leap brought to you before you try to do another leap.
You bet, you bet. So like the version of this in my subfield in particular was a lot of early social neuroscience folks. They were social psychologists who caught like the bug, like the brain imaging bug at some point, and they're like, yes, let's use these neuroimaging tools to try and understand things about social behavior. So they'd put people in the scanner, they'd have them look at like different things, they would see the amygdala light up, and then they would make these like really bold, big claims about, okay, so the amygdala activated more for, looking at pictures of these people versus those people. Therefore, we are afraid of the first group, right? Because the amygdala activated, and the amygdala means fear. And it turns out that it's not that simple at all. And they missed the whole part where they were mapping the sky, trying to figure out what the amygdala does. The amygdala is not just one thing, it's a collection of different subnuclei that all have different inputs and outputs, right? But like all this stuff, they like, I mean, I don't mean to dunk on them, but
Yeah.
like,
But I mean, it's a mistake.
and you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
But I think they wanted to take it to like oh, look, we have this tool to figure out like how people are thinking about these two groups. Great, right? Instead of like, what does the amygdala do under what context, and how is this brain activation pattern mapping to these kind of social domains? Is it at a broad level of I'm afraid of certain kinds of people, or is it something just smaller? Like, amygdalas can be sensitive to kind of lower level sensory processes, and maybe it's just that. And if you don't take the time to unpack that, you can lead yourself astray pretty quickly. But, to do that kind of work is expensive and doesn't necessarily have a return on investment.
Yeah.
So,
And it's not as sexy, right? I mean, the problem with like a lot of science communication and even research, I think, especially in a published or parish paradigm, is that it's the nuance gets lost often
absolutely.
and easily. With the amygdala, it's like, if we say the words amygdala or dopamine to 99% of people, they're going to think that it has one thing and it always does that one thing, but there's no context there, right? They're not paying attention to other brain state activations, environment, or anything like that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Those are some good examples.
Yeah. Speaking of, like, do you look at any specific regions or neurotransmitters or hormones like oxytocin or vasopressin? I know you do a lot with, I think, the medial prefrontal cortex, but like, what are some of the areas of focus for you specifically?
Yeah. So the medial prefrontal cortex is if I had to pick a brain region that, we focus on the most, it's certainly that. We measure all the brain, in the kind of work that we do, we're likely to be able to measure all, within our kind of level of analysis, I guess. We measure the whole brain at the same time. So we kind of get to pick after thought what brain region we're most interested in. I think that's a blessing and a curse, because at some level people can get a little wishy-washy with what they're looking at. But, in general, the parts of the brain that I think are the most interesting are the medial prefrontal cortex, regions like the posterior cingulate cortex, certain parts of the temporal parietal junction, temporal poles, and then some subcortical regions that are involved in affective processing, like the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, hippocampus. And so, when I say we're looking at those, like, we're kind of looking at everything, but those are the ones that pop out the most in some of these analyses. And, when we're talking about what drives my like interests, it's not like I picked these things. It's not like I looked at the brain and was like, oh, these regions seem okay. It's just that these regions seem to be most consistently involved, not just within my own work, but across lots of people's work in the types of things that I care about. Things like, how do we think about other people? How do we think about ourselves? How do we process emotions? Those kind of things. And that actually, knowing that they're happening in these kind of regions then makes me want to dig in a little bit more. It's like, okay, the medial prefrontal cortex pops out a lot. What is it doing? And that actually like makes it, for me at least, it kind of broadens my psychological interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we know the medial prefrontal cortex is not just involved in social cognition, it's also involved in all kinds of things, reward processing, economic decisions, certain kinds of regulation, like self-regulation kind of, emotion regulation kind of procedures. It just depends on what you're talking about. And then I'm just like, okay, now we're in business. Like, we're trying to figure out what this brain region is computing for a given task. And it's not as simple as this is the social cognition region. Like we're still developing a framework for even thinking about how to interpret brain activation within a given region under certain conditions. And that's kind of the less sexy, boring work part of it. But the part that over the years I've really started to like, it has become my favorite part.
Yeah. Is that messy context side of things kind of maybe a product of like neural reuse, of evolutionary reuse over time, where a region that was developed for something 400 million years ago became useful 50 million years ago for social dynamics, and they just kind of were like, let's push that into that brain region that is already doing things? Like, is that part of the messiness there, do you think?
Yeah, I bet you it is. So this is, the idea that things that, were evolved in these certain contexts for different species, like ancestral species, as our brains have grown, like they've been kind of exapted, so to speak, for other things. And that stuff is probably happening at some level or another, right? And we certainly have evidence for this for a variety of different things. I'll try to give a concrete example. So one of my friends from graduate school, she's now a professor at UCLA. Her name's Carolyn Parkinson. Back in the day, when we were still students together, she did this really fascinating study where they were basically looking at brain pattern activation things and training these machine learning models to differentiate people looking at something that's close in time versus far in time, and something that's close in distance versus far in distance, and something that people that they know that we're either close to them, close friends, versus, acquaintances, people they don't know as well. And what they did was they trained the model on each of these three, like these distances: social distance, temporal distance, spatial distance, and then applied the decision boundary from the models to each of the other tasks. They basically, can I train a model on spatial distance, apply the distinction to social distance, and are there parts of the brain that do that? And it turns out that there's a part of the brain up in the parietal lobe that kind of seems to compute all three of those things. And what's cool about that, or at least what fits in with what you're saying, is that there's an argument to be made about how this brain region was co-opted. It was probably built for distance and spatial processing at some level, but then got co-opted for these social comparison things. Now, I don't want to overstate it too much, because like once you get like more brain on there, you're adding a lot more nodes to a network, and it's not clear how the additional nodes change the network properties in a way that makes them hard to compare to like the ones with fewer nodes. Like, how do you compare, like, even a simple example, 100 node network to one that only has 60? Are the 60 nodes that were there originally doing the same thing? It's hard to tell. But that's, again, one of these questions that still needs to be unpacked a bit.
It does seem inspiring ways to think about it, though. Like, I feel like I've heard primates tend to carry around like a mental map in a hierarchy structure where they spatially actually place higher ranking members of their group at a higher position and lower ranking members at a lower position. And it does seem to make sense. Like, I think you're saying that, we would first have a spatial map that we evolved, then a cognitive map would kind of lay over that, and then a social map would have to lay over that. And it seems like we would organize in these spatial structures.
Yeah, I mean, these ideas are sort of hard to test, but they're really compelling. Right. And, and they make sense at some level. It's more efficient to use, a model of something else that you already have machinery for, than it is to create a whole other thing, right?
Right.
And then glue those together within the brain, which is already there and running, right? It seems weird that it seems more efficient to just kind of figure out a way to change the system to say, hey, this is a social thing and not a spatial thing. But then you need something in the brain to say, to compute or to tell the rest of the brain, hey, this is a social thing and not a spatial thing. So there's both, right? There's the reuse and the, repurposing and the similar computations, but then there has to be something else that says this is a different context too. Yeah. And then when you zoom out, you need all that stuff together, and how we actually understand that is still a really entrenched, entangled mystery.
Yeah.
And I think it's fascinating, and it's what keeps me, it's my favorite part of this work. Yeah. But when people rush to conclusions about all this stuff without thinking about that, it's frustrating. But at the same time, I don't blame them, because I want to rush to think about these things too. But making sure that we don't get too far ahead of ourselves is something I think we're all working on a little bit.
Right. Do we have any leading contenders for maybe what that switch might be? I'm thinking, for instance, of I think it's a virtual ball toss game where when it's people. Yes, Cyberball. Thank you. When it's people, and somebody is ignored, I think you get activation in the anterior cingulate cortex, the pain region for rejection, like social pain, physical pain, again, neural reuse. Mm-hmm. But when they think that it's a bot or a machine or an AI that's ignoring them, you don't see that same activation. And that seems to indicate, I would think, that there's a part of the brain that's saying, oh, I'm not being socially neglected. This isn't a person. This isn't a social cognition moment. This is something else.
Yeah, or there's another part of the brain that's saying this isn't a social task, ACC, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So it's hard to actually test these things sometimes. But yeah, when you're interacting with bots, maybe, there's probably not a part of the brain that's a switch that says, hey, social thing is on, go.
Yeah.
But we don't have I don't think we have a really good theoretical framework even for answering those kinds of questions. We're not even really asking them. They might be baked into a lot of the stuff that we do, but to test that thing, what's the part of the brain that differentiates part of the brain? What is the brain spatiotemporal pattern that dissociates, a social event from a non-social event? Right. We have some hints, we know the regions that are sort of involved in that, but what are they doing and how are they different from one another is still kind of, I don't think, a really well answered question.
Right. And it could be totally non-related in a lot of ways, right? Where it just is weighting the salience or the valence way less, so that it's saying, hey, this actually isn't something to be concerned about. It's not that it's social or not. It's just less concerning because there's less cost associated.
That's right. And, maybe that different weighting of valence and all these other things is what makes it social, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to something else, right? And again, we don't have a framework that has unpacked that as well as some people might assume.
Right. So for you, let's say we take this kind of a spatial map of social networks, with your work, are you seeing something that does kind of separate the individual and the self-cognition, the self-referencing, self-reflective cognition from how we maybe think about the other and those around us?
Yeah, so now we're starting to get into my area of expertise, I guess. So there's lots of parts of the brain that are involved in both self-representation, what happens when we're thinking about ourselves, and parts of the brain that are involved in thinking about other people. And some of our paradigms that we use are getting at exactly that. Now, what ends up happening is there's some regions that seem to be a little bit more involved in self than for others, and then there's some that are maybe a little bit more involved for others than self, but there's just a huge amount of overlap between these systems. So it's not this is the self part of the brain and this is the others part of the brain. It's much more entangled than that. So we've been trying to think of how can we capitalize on some of that stuff to maybe further unpack these things. So this is a really recent, this is a paper that's under review currently, but it's one I've been thinking about a lot lately. Basically what we did was we had people come into the scanner, come into our study. They were groups of 6 people, so they didn't come in at the same time, but we recruited people in what we call a round robin design. So every person in the study was, a person in the study, but they were also a person that other 6 people thought about. So you get all of the, mappings between one another, right?
Right.
And we did this in a group of 20 people, so we had 100 and something people, which is decent for these kind of analyses. And what we did was, because we had everybody in the study everybody within a group rate one another on these things and think about one another in these metrics, we could calculate different information about them. So I know it's getting really abstract at this point.
You're fine.
What we did was we took these measures of warmth and competence, which is this kind of model that's really useful in social psychology, of how we kind of think about other people, people high in warmth. The example I give when I give talks on this is like characters from The Office, the American Office. So Dwight Schrute is high in competence, low in warmth, right? Whereas, Kevin, the accountant, is, pretty high in warmth, but pretty low in competence, and everybody's somewhere in that space, right? Well, we have these measures for everybody rating one another in these groups, and we also have measures of them rating themselves, right? So what we can do is we can calculate within a person, right, using their own ratings, we can say, okay, let's calculate the distance between all of the different people in their groups in terms of these warmth competence dimensions, right? So you can actually calculate a literal distance between how you rated them. And so that's one kind of distance. We call that allocentric distance, borrowing from spatial cognition studies, right? But because we have their own ratings on themselves, we can calculate egocentric distance too. So not just the distance between all the people and one another, but the distance between how we rate ourselves and all of the other people in our network. And these are different mathematically, right? So if you have somebody who's, let's say you rate them, this is just a toy example, but let's say you rate yourself a 3 on some metric, and you have a friend who you rate a 1 and another friend who you rate a 5, you have the same egocentric distance between each of those people, even though they have a much bigger allocentric distance between one another, right? So they're mathematically distinct. And then what we can do is we can map that those distances in how we're rating one another to see if they're similar to distances in how the brain responds to people when they're thinking about one another in the scanner, right? And what we find is, when people are doing allocentric, this model of allocentric distance picks up on these kind of standard social cognitive regions, like the VMPFC and the PCC and other regions. It also picks up on regions that just do general spatial processing,
right,
like distance processing, like we were talking about before with the repurposing. But the egocentric distance is the one that was interesting to me. What we find is in the ACC and the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, that's the region that mapped on, or that seemed to reflect how people did the egocentric distance calculations, but it was reverse of what you might think. So the closer you were to somebody in warmth competence space, according to your ratings, the more distant they were in terms of the brain representations. And this isn't a part of the brain that we know is involved in mentalizing and empathy and thinking about others. And why that's interesting to me is that saying hey, so we see this brain, it's the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. We see this brain region come on all the time in these tasks of mentalizing. And we assume when it's coming on, it's doing something about processing information about other people. But what is it doing? And part of what I like about this particular result is it's saying, yes, it's coming on, but what it's doing is it's separating people that are close to us from people that are different from us. And that is really useful when trying to engage in mentalizing or empathetic processes, right? If my daughter is crying, and I want to help her, I need to make sure my brain needs to compute. She's not me. I'm not crying. Like I care about her, and there's something that does that, and that is a different kind of interpretation about what the
Yeah.
DMPFC is doing than the standard, like, oh, it's doing the empathy. No, it's what it's computing is at least in this study, um, it's doing this kind of separation process that may hopefully at some level allow me to engage in those kind of helping or whatever behaviors. But that's one of the ways that the self is different from the other. They're kind of
Yeah.
integral. But if you're looking at it the right way, you can find these differences in things, and that will hopefully help us kind of unpack what these brain regions are actually computing, is how I think about it. But what they're doing, right? We know what's involved. We know what brain regions are involved. Now we need to know how they're working, right? And just because one brain region is involved in two seemingly different processes doesn't mean it's doing the same thing in both. Right. And the example I give for this is like, or the kind of metaphor I like to use is just because, two people work at the same building doesn't mean they have the same job, right? You don't know what's going on in that building, and that's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, that reminds me, I think it's Lieberman's work. I think he wrote Molecule of More on dopamine. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that book.
I don't think so.
The interesting thing, I guess, is that he says we have the here and now chemicals like serotonin, and then we have the molecule of more like dopamine, and he kind of draws a distance between them and says dopamine is that which is far away that we need neurological motivation to go pursue, and then we have chemicals that take care of the things that are close to us and that we have within reach. And he actually breaks it down as a distance calculation, right? That
that's
those yeah, so I don't know. It's just kind of cool the way with what we're talking with the neural reuse, the distance, the spatial thing, that there seems to be a lot going on in the brain that is very heavily focused on how it orients itself physically, like as a physical entity in the world as related to other things. And that seems to change what brain regions are calculating.
Yeah, and just like for brain regions, like for neurotransmitters, people want to put a lot of stock into single ones and its use and things, and I get the motivation to do that, and of course we know these things are involved, but I think the biggest problem I see, or problem, I don't know, one of the things I see most often in the way that both scientists and non-scientists think about brains and brain function and all these things is they're trying to take this thing which is really high dimensional, right? The brain and the mind and this really, interacting systems, and they're trying to project it on this low dimensional space that's easy to comprehend. Oh, it's good for this and it's good for that. And that's fine. That's part of what science does. We can't have it be in high dimensional space. Otherwise it's not good, right? But it's the translating that into the lower dimensional model that you lose a lot of the detail, including maybe some important things. And I think a lot of people want the low dimensional model to be the real one, and it can't be. It's a model, right?
Right.
And I think it's easy, even for myself, I know things that are big and complicated, and then I just try to press them down into this little experimental paradigm, and then I interpret them too widely. But that is everywhere, right?
Confusing the map for the territory a little bit, I guess.
Right, and it's and it always makes me wonder about other kinds of issues that happen when you take high dimensional things and project them onto low dimensional spaces. And language, human understanding through language use is a much lower dimensional space than is the cognitive and psychological processes that we're trying to understand.
On that note, have you done any work or have any ideas on the way in which culture and kind of what I would call the symbolic or linguistic realm plays on this? I'm a big fan of like gene culture coevolution ideas, and I think this I talked about this recently with Steve Stewart Williams, an evolutionary psychologist, and we were talking about how Sapolsky's work with the baboons, where the alphas died off from bovine tuberculosis. And then it seemed like the females kind of took over and the lower ranking males, and it became more of like a reciprocal rather than a aggressive type value system. And then the testosterone seemed to be, there's not a lot of like replicated studies, so it's really hard to say, but it seemed like the neurobiology kind of responded to the culture and changed its I guess it's the proclivities it gave us, the things that it made us want to do based on what culture rewarded. And I guess I'm just wondering, is that anywhere in your work these days? Do you play around with those ideas at all or calculate that into the equation?
No. No, I love reading about this stuff because I think it's really, important to consider. And, a lot of work in my subfield, mine included, just kind of doesn't take that into account. And, that's kind of a hidden issue. It's not actually hidden. It's pretty in plain view, but it's something we just haven't wrestled with. So, I talk a lot about the self, whatever that is. But, I'm interested in what happens in our brain when we're thinking about when we're asked to think about ourselves. But what the self means, that even that word is really kind of loaded and imprecise, and it means different things in different cultures. Now, does that mean the brain is doing different things? Like, that's an open question, and maybe what you're getting at a little bit. But then the question is, well, then how and why? And it wouldn't make sense for, it to be completely different. Like, right. Your arms are the same, like the mechanisms that make your arms pick up things and they might do different things in different cultures, but the arm mechanisms themselves are the same, right? So how do you, the brain must be similar at some level, right? It's doing different things that are important in different contexts, and it should be meeting that challenge with whatever the brain does to meet it.
But that's the core of it,
right?
Yeah. And that's the core of it, right? Is like, it's not that the brain would just be saying, do whatever gives you status or group membership, right? Do whatever helps you stay safe within your group. Whatever that looks like culturally is what you'll do. But that means that the human condition isn't necessarily X, it's X plus environment, right? I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at with that.
Yeah, and it'd be nice to have, studies that kind of relate these things. That kind of work is so challenging.
Yeah.
When I talk to students, they often say, well, how come nobody has ever done this? And it's like, well, because it's like, it'd be great, but it's harder than it seems. It's not that people like haven't thought about it. It's just that it's like, oh, wow. Where would I begin?
Find me a feasible study that we can afford to run that's ethical.
I'm absolutely guilty of that too.
Yeah. Do you think about this at all in terms of I'm kind of just running some of my like pet favorite topics through you and just seeing what your thoughts are on, if that's okay.
Yeah.
But like one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is kind of what I would call like the digital second self, right? So this idea that we are now building virtual avatars of ourselves. And I'm kind of online and social media and stuff, right? Where if I get a like, it's not that that's disconnected from me, right? Like that social validation, the little hit I get of social acceptance from that digital version of me getting a follow transcends the internet and goes directly into me as well. So what do you think about the way in which the self has kind of been extended outward into the digital and is now having these interactions in this other kind of network that is so is so different from our evolutionary environment, I guess?
Yeah. Well, then you start to get into what I think of as kind of like the philosophical quicksand of the philosophy of the self, and then you hit the consciousness wall where everything just falls off the cliff. And it's hard because like even when I ask somebody, or maybe I can ask you, like, how many selves do you think there are? Like, do you have one self and it just shapes differently, or do you have multiple selves?
Yeah. And I think multiple would probably be my guess.
And when I ask this of different people, they have different answers to it. It's like, oh, I have my work self, and I have my home self, and I have my digital self, and I have my, other things. And that's one way to think about it. And when I ask philosophers this, most of them tend to agree with you. It's like, well, of course we have multiple selves. But then, as a neuroscientist, I'm like, well, it's the same brain operating like these machinery. Is it just this like bad term that we have, self,
Maybe.
that is making us think that? When I think about it, I kind of think the self is, this is a bad metaphor maybe, but like I tend to think of it more like a small, like a pitcher of water, a vase of water, right? And I can pour it into the vase, I can pour it into a bucket, I can pour it, but it's all the same water. It's just taking on different shapes, right?
Right.
Now, whether or not that's accurate or not, and even if it was, like what that would say, is a different question. But when we're asking about, how does the, projecting yourself to a digital space affect things? I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think you could have asked the same thing about, writing in a different era. What does it mean to, put your thoughts down onto this verbal page where people don't get all this other kind of contextual information about you? If I'm writing my autobiography, which sounds terrible, you're going to get me filtered through this kind of verbal lens and through this narrative that I craft or whatever, but that's not going to be me talking to me in real life. And online, it's not the same, obviously, but it's not that different, right? At least the philosophical questions about what does it mean to have a different, identity, so to speak, through that medium. I don't know. It's a tough question, but I don't know as far as what the neurobiology or whatever says of it. It just seems like it's a different thing to point your efforts at.
Fair. Yeah.
It's an unexplored landscape, but it's still me out there exploring it. I'm just figuring it out.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that makes sense to me, right? Like, I guess I think of the self often as just like a model, like kind of floating in a landscape of other models. And I feel like we could say that in the same way we were talking about the change of culture, all the internet might represent is just another environment that the same kind of biological proclivities are responding to. That model's still just computing the same computations. It's just doing it with a different data set.
That's I think I hadn't thought about it like that, but that's probably pretty similar to how I think about it when I'm not overanalyzing it, I guess.
Right. Too philosophically. Yeah. Well, I guess kind of where I'm going with that a little bit, I'm wondering your thoughts on this. Is there an applied side of this or something that you carry over into your day-to-day life? Like, one thing I find very interesting about these topics, especially because I look at them often through the lens of like stress, and what that kind of does to our decision making, and that stress that comes from things like being lower socioeconomically, having high ACE scores from childhood trauma, like all kinds of different things we can look at, right? Do you bring anything over from your work into the realm of like what you might do to change how you move through the world, or what kind of policies you think would be better as a society if we implemented them?
Yeah, to be honest, I actively try to avoid it.
Fair enough.
And it's not because I don't think it's important. I actually think it's paramount to be able to take scientific knowledge and apply it to real world problems. I often catch myself avoiding it for the things we talked about earlier. Like, I don't want to give people a Newtonian like prediction about something that's based on a map of, a tiny portion of the sky. And that's what makes me hesitant to do too much of it. That said, I don't have too many, but I have a couple that I have thought of and I know that I do. So from my work, some of it recent work, but some of it a little bit older too, what we have found, I don't want to go into all the details, but basically what we found is, there are parts of the brain that are involved in self-referential processing, thinking about yourself, that are really overlap with, or entangled is the word that I use a lot, with systems that are involved in reward processing, right? So the medial prefrontal cortex, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is involved in, appetitive processes and valuation, right? When we see something we like, when we eat yummy chocolate or whatever it is, right? It is also connected to other parts of the reward system, the nucleus accumbens and whatnot. And we found a lot of evidence, or we found multiple lines of evidence that show that the connectivity of these systems is related to self-evaluative processes. So people who have higher self-esteem have higher connectivity, both structurally and functionally. There's some evidence for within these systems. So, how does that lead to the applied thing? It's saying that, there's something about it's not saying we find ourselves rewarding necessarily, but it's saying something about whatever self-reflection is picking up on these reward and motivation processes that are involved in things more broadly. And that is probably not an accident. That's probably true, right? So the way that I've used this in the world is, what do people like? They like themselves. They like having a platform to talk about themselves, and you can get this stuff kind of, you can find it. Not everybody, of course, does it to the same degree, but I remember when I was interviewing for jobs and when I was interviewing for grad school and things like that, I went into the office. This was for grad school. I went into the office of a professor. You had to sit down and have an interview with them, and I didn't know much about his work. And I was sort of scared to talk to him. So all I did was go in there. I knew he did some kind of computational work on something. And I was just like, hey, yeah, so I noticed you do some computational modeling of this thing. What do you think of the Blue Brain project? And he just spent the next 15 minutes telling me what he thought about the Blue Brain project. And it's just that I knew a little bit about him, gave him a chance to talk about himself and his thing in there, and then he loved me. And it's not because of anything I did. It's just he misattributed his enthusiasm for the topic to the person who sat in front of him, right? And that doesn't work for everybody, for sure. But you see hints of that everywhere. I think that's in part because thinking about ourselves and our work and everything is part of this motivation reward system, and that's very interconnected with these parts of the brain that are involved in thinking about other people as well, these attribution kind of systems. So that's the only applied thing, but that seems like it could be used in all kinds of nefarious ways too.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why I don't necessarily jump to the application stuff. It's because there's lots of ways to do applied work that seems great on the surface but can backfire. You see this stuff in clinical trials sometimes too, and often we don't even test for it very much in psychology. It's like, oh, we came up with this intervention to help people, but we don't always test for iatrogenic effects where things get worse. We don't have clinical trials for certain kinds of interventions in the same way they have clinical trials for pharmaceutical drugs, right? And you have to be careful. So yeah, I like applied stuff. I think that's the point of all of this, right? It's not just a playground for ideas,
right?
Or it's not just supposed to be that. But if anything, I think I've gotten less applied over the years, only because it seems so hard and scary.
Right. Well, and to your own admission earlier, it forces you, I think, into confusing the model for the data. That's what I mean? It sounds like you're trying to put a lot of effort into not confusing the map and territory. And then if you go too much into the applied, it makes it easy to do that.
But I'm glad people are doing that, because that's important too. And having translators between those two worlds is really important. So I don't want to say that people shouldn't be doing that because we don't understand everything. There's ways to make the world better without having to understand everything. It's just that my own work is less focused on that.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I'm going to use some of your own manipulative magic against you now, because you just gave me a perfect opportunity.
You've been doing it the whole time. I feel really good.
There's a little bit of a dance here for sure. But what is well, I'm going to give you that floor, right? What I want you to leave this with a lot of positive affect. So for you, what is a thing that you've been really passionate about lately? What is a thing that has given you a lot of enthusiasm and excitement in your work?
Yeah. So I don't know. That's a good question. I have the problem of kind of being interested in too many things, right?
Hmm. I know
So
that.
yeah, so and over the years I've gotten to like, I don't know, focus more on some versus the others. And like now it's actually been fun just to kind of like scale back and be like, okay, so I used to think a lot about when I was an undergrad, evolutionary psychology, and I got really into that. I learned a lot about that, and then I started to get into neuroscience, and I got really into that, and I'm still kind of into all these things, statistics and machine learning, and now it's kind of fun to. The thing that I'm passionate about is like unstructured playtime. Like I
Mm.
collected all of these different knowledge bases, but I've always been really focused on them one at a time, kind of, or two at a time. Now it'd be fun. What I'm passionate about is zooming out and trying to figure out, is there anything that goes together here? Is that just like me imposing something on that? And like, I feel like I finally have enough of a knowledge base to kind of zoom out a little bit and see if there's anything going on. Um, and that's fun,
Yeah.
more than anything else. And I know that's a really abstract way of saying it, but it's honestly how I feel. It's just like,
Yeah.
I to give credit to all my mentors and to like everybody in my life, like I got educated. That's fucking cool. Um,
Yeah, man.
um, like and now I feel like I clearly don't know everything, and I'm still learning all the time, and that's part of the point. But like it's nice to stop from time to time and like take it in for a second and enjoy it. Like I do this with my kids. Like there's points I make a point to do it, like to stop and just breathe in. Like they're not going to be this age forever.
Mm.
Make a mental timestamp of it so you can enjoy it later. I'm trying to do that stuff with my work now too. Stop and take in all these things that and then look to see like, wow, this is awesome, and find out where you can give it back. So taking on a student who does something that isn't really in the purview of what I do, but trying to show them like, hey, there's lots of different ways to approach this, and like that kind of stuff is really fulfilling. So that's not like a great answer. Like,
No, I mean, I love hearing that. I feel like I'm a person who fits inside that box and I was always desired to get more involved in that kind of stuff. But part of the struggle for me is exactly what you're expressing. Is I think so many people get caught with their head down that they don't see that big picture, and they don't see the fun and the play as beneficial, even though it very much is like, especially now with the value of interdisciplinary work, I think is maybe more important than ever.
absolutely. And the metaphor that I like to give my students when we're going out to get data for things or designing a new study is, sometimes we won't have the funding, let's say, to do some big, so we'll have to use like secondary data, like data that already exists. And when you do that, like you don't get to design the study. Like you have to use whatever's there. And the metaphor I use is the pantry metaphor. So, if you want to cook something for dinner and you have the whole grocery store at your disposal, you can make whatever you want to, right? But when you're using secondary data, you kind of just have what's in the pantry. And if you have enough knowledge and enough creativity into things, you can actually make all kinds of things with a very limited pantry.
Right.
But figuring out how to do that is what I think has come along over the years, and what I try to get my students to do. It's like you're never going to have everything at your disposal, but you have so much more if you're armed with this knowledge base to work with than you would if you didn't. And I feel pretty strongly about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna push you a little bit
Yeah.
because you admitted that we had a kind of maybe a more abstract answer there. Is there anything on that map that you're stepping back and looking at? Is there anything as you do get this time to play that is maybe poking its head up above the horizon, or revealing itself as more salient to you? Is there something you're saying, ooh, maybe this is a thing I want to lean into more?
Yeah. Well, no, I suppose.
I mean, and that's fine. No,
Well,
it's fine.
I mean, what I actually want to do more is not so much science communication, but more writing for a general audience,
Mm.
um, and getting into that kind of thing. Now, what that will look like, I don't really want to write a trade book. Because lots of people have done that, and I'm not sure if I could do it, but I don't
Yeah.
know what I have to add. But then if it's not that, what would it be? And that's what I'm sort of actually thinking about a lot now. So, so I'm trying to work out, work out the cobwebs of my general writing. So, I have my Substack that I'm trying to get going and things like that. But other than that, it's kind of shifting more in terms of more of our work and what we're doing there. We've been thinking a lot about, narratives and naturalistic processing now. It's like, how do we, as humans, make meaning of things? We make meanings of things through these kind of storytelling and narratives, and and lots of people have been doing work on this for a long time. And it only sort of relatively recently occurred to social neuroscientists that, hey, we could actually borrow some of this stuff and get people to engage in that in a more naturalistic way in the fMRI scanner, the least naturalistic thing in the world.
Right.
But maybe we can try and use that kind of knowledge base and that stuff to understand how the brain processes these things in different ways. And that will require all of the tools at our disposal that we need. We need the social psychology and personality psychology that have figured a lot of these stuff out, so we're not reinventing the wheel in terms of how people think about narratives and think about their self narratives. But we're also going to need a lot of sophisticated computational tools to process information about time series and frequency spectra while people are going up and down and these kind of things, to interpret what the brain activity even means in those contexts. And that's going to be a real challenge that, again, requires all this stuff that we've been doing all this time together. So, you can do the simple stuff. Oh, this brain region correlates with that one. Great. That's a great place to start. But where do you go from there? And what questions are you even asking? And that's what I'm passionate about now, and it probably will be working on for a few years.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that speaks to one of my favorite places to play. So you're speaking my language there. Well, with that being said, I feel like we're getting at a good time here. I want to make sure I don't go too far overboard, so you have your day to yourself. But is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with? Any thoughts? Maybe something that we talked about that you wanted to speak more upon, or something that you want to push people towards? Anything at all?
Yeah. So I don't have anything in particular. The thing that I'll say, which is, if anybody who talks to me knows this is like a trope of mine, but it's the advice I give to new parents, but it's the same advice I kind of give to everybody about everything, which is, when you're consuming information about neuroscience for sure, but lots of different things, is to make sure, listen to everyone, but don't really listen to anyone. And what I mean by that is, make sure you're sampling the space and collecting lots of different ideas, but don't hang your hat on any given individual person's perspective, because we're still in the early ages of a lot of this stuff, and myself included in there. And I think when you do that, it'll arm you with the kind of healthy skepticism without undermining the enthusiasm for all this stuff. And I think that's important.
Yeah, it's a great sentiment to leave on. There you go. Thank you so much for your time, Rob. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thank you.